All right, today we're tackling a really controversial one. Arthur Koestler's 1976 book, The 13th Tribe. Now this book, it didn't just question history, it tried to rewrite a fundamental piece of it. So let's get right into its central and pretty explosive argument. So let's start with a really big question. Where do the ancestors of most of today's Jews come from? Now, you probably have a pretty quick answer for that, right? The historic land of Israel. Seems straightforward. But according to Arthur Koestler, that conventional answer, well, it might not be the whole story. And that's really the central mystery he's trying to solve in this book. And this is the question, right from the book's flyleaf that just stops you in your tracks. Are today's Western Jews really ethnic, Semitic, biblical Jews, or are most of them descendants of converted Khazars? Whoa! I mean, that's not just a small question, is it? Koestler is throwing down the gauntlet here. He's proposing a completely radical alternative history, and it's one that really shakes up our fundamental ideas about identity and where people come from.
So you might be wondering, how on earth does he even begin to build a case like that? Well, Koestler starts by presenting it all as this huge, unsolved puzzle in European history.
Okay, so here's the puzzle. Koestler points to two massive events that happen around the same time. First, you have this powerful kingdom, the Khazars, and they just vanish. Poof, gone from the history books. Then, right around the same time, and in the very same region, Eastern Europe, the world's largest Jewish population seems to appear out of nowhere. Koestler looks at this and says, no way is that a coincidence. He argues these two things are directly linked, and that's the core of what he calls the Khazar hypothesis.
So, to really get what he's talking about with this hypothesis, we need to meet the main characters in this whole drama, the Khazars.
So check this out. The book paints a picture of the Khazar Empire as a serious powerhouse back in the 7th to 10th centuries. And look where they were located. It was absolutely crucial. They controlled this vital strip of land right between the Black and Caspian Seas. They were basically the buffer zone, the gatekeepers between two giant expanding worlds.
So, who were these guys really? Well, according to Koestler, they were a Turkic people. And we're not talking about some minor tribe here. No, they were a formidable military power. So tough, in fact, that they actually blocked the Arab Caliphate's advance into Eastern Europe for a while. They ruled over this huge multi-ethnic empire, and because of their location, they absolutely dominated the main trade routes between the East and the West.
Now, being in that position, it put them under incredible pressure. Think of it like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one side, you've got the Christian Byzantine Empire. On the other, the Muslim Arab Caliphate. Two superpowers, and both of them are constantly pushing the Khazars, saying, hey, you need to convert. You need to pick our side.
And it's this immense pressure, Koestler argues, that led the Khazars to do something absolutely remarkable. A truly calculated move, one that would echo through history. So, instead of caving to either side, the Khazars did something genius. They chose a third way. The book suggests that around the year 740, the Khazar leadership, the king, the nobles, they all converted to Judaism. Now, why would they do that? Well, think about it. If they became Christian, they'd be subordinate to the emperor in Constantinople. If they became Muslim, they'd be a vassal of the caliph in Baghdad. But by choosing Judaism, they didn't have to answer to either of them. They could remain this independent third force.
Koestler is very clear on this point. He doesn't frame this conversion as some big spiritual awakening. Not at all. He sees it as a classic case of realpolitik, politics based on what's practical, not what's ideological. It was a totally pragmatic, strategic move, all about ensuring the kingdom could survive and stay independent. A political masterstroke, really.
But as we know, even the greatest empires don't last forever, and the Khazar kingdom was no exception. Eventually, it too began to decline. And this wasn't a quick collapse. It happened over centuries. So it starts around 830, with new invaders showing up, especially the Vikings, who were called the Rus in that region. Then, boom, 965 AD, a devastating blow. The Rus prince Sviatoslav completely destroys the Khazar capital Itzel. The final nail in the coffin comes in the 13th century when the Mongol hordes sweep through and just absorb whatever was left of the Khazar state.
So the empire's gone. But what about the people? Where did they all go? This right here is the missing piece of Koestler's puzzle. He proposes that after their homeland was destroyed, the Khazar people didn't just disappear. They began a massive migration, moving west and northwest into what we now know as Eastern Europe, places like Poland, Hungary, and Lithuania.
And it's this migration that brings us to the absolute core of Quaesler's argument. This is the big reveal, where all the pieces come together.
This is it. This is Koestler's big thesis. He says that these migrating Khazars, they are the explanation for that sudden appearance of a huge Jewish population in Eastern Europe. He argues that these migrants, these Khazars, formed the demographic core of what would become Ashkenazi Jewry. So in his view, the ancestors of most Eastern European Jews weren't from the Middle East, they were from this converted Turkic kingdom.
Let me just put that as plainly as possible, because it is an explosive claim. Koestler's book argues that many Ashkenazi Jews are descended not from Semitic tribes from the Jordan River, but from Turkic people from the Volga River, that their Jewish identity comes not from an ancient bloodline, but from a mass conversion hundreds of years ago.
And this leads to what is maybe the book's most controversial and honestly most profound implication. It's really important to note that Koestler himself was Jewish. And he argued that if this theory is true, if Ashkenazi Jews are descended from Khazars, then the whole racial basis for anti-Semitism just completely falls apart. It becomes, in his own words, a misapprehension shared by both the killers and their victims. Just a staggering, tragic irony of history.
So where does that leave us? Well, Arthur Koestler's The 13th Tribe is still, to this day, a fiercely debated book. It's important to say that it's been largely rejected by mainstream historians. But it just hasn't gone away. It keeps a foothold in popular discussions. And maybe that's because it leaves us with this huge lingering question. Is it a forgotten empire or a hidden history? And more than that, it forces us to ask ourselves, how much do the stories we tell about where we come from actually define who we are today?